A major tragedy that's been going on in America over the past few years is known as the opioid epidemic. I've only been slightly affected by this epidemic. I know most people, a lot of people I know, people in different parts of the country have been much, much more affected than I have. When I was growing up in suburbia, I had a friend around the corner from me, and we used to play hockey together in the cul-de-sac. And he was a neighbor. I liked him, and then we were out of touch for a while. And I later found out he died of a heroin overdose. One of the questions that I think about a lot is, what was his experience like? What's it like being on the inside of that? There's a Borges story that I really love. It's called the Zahir. And it's not about addiction. It's about, if anything, it seems to be about mental illness, like an extreme form of obsessive compulsive disorder, an extreme obsessive mind, intrusive thoughts that can't be controlled. But the experience that he describes in that story, to me, seems to have at least some analogy, some similarity to what I imagine the experience of falling into drug addiction must be. In the story, Borges describes a narrowing of focus, a sense in which all other things in life become unimportant, irrelevant, they fall into the background, and the entirety of a person's focus is this one single object. Nothing else matters. And it's a really terrifying thing to describe. It's a really horrible, horrible abyss to fall into. But Borges, in a really subversive way, he almost romanticizes it. He's not alarmist about his experience. It reminds me a little bit almost of the tone of Kafka's Metamorphoses. In Kafka's Metamorphoses, Georg Samsa wakes up and he's a cockroach, or this giant bug, and he's sort of okay with it in a weird way. I mean, he recognizes how terrible it is, but he says, this is my new reality. And he's just going to try to make the best of it. And there's something of that tone also in Borges's The Zahir. It's like falling into this abyss of infinitely small focus, and nothing else can penetrate. And Borges in this story says, basically, I'm okay with this. People who know me know that I don't own very many books. I usually take my books out of the library, but I have my small library at home of the most important books to me, the books that I revisit the most. And Jorge Luis Borges' collected fictions is certainly part of that collection of my most treasured and valued books. One of the really fascinating things that Borges does in this story is he links his own experience, this experience of obsession, of intrusive thoughts that can't be controlled, of this narrowing of focus. He links it to other more common experiences that the reader would be familiar with. And he seems to be saying that even though my case is more extreme and more debilitating, we're all on the same path. This is a human experience that is familiar to you, the reader. Borges writes, the Jews and the Chinese codified every human situation. The Mishnah tells us that beginning at sunset on the Shabbat, a tailor may not go into the street carrying a needle. The Book of Rites informs us that a guest receiving his first glass of wine must assume a grave demeanor, receiving the second a respectful, happy air. So at this point he's talking about religion or Confucianism and the rigorous, you might say almost obsessive demands that these communities place on people. This kind of obsession. And now he continues, and he's going to be talking about this woman named Teodolina Villar, who committed suicide, a woman that Borges was in love with. Because he sees his fate, a fate of infinite obsession, as being sort of paralleled by her fate, which was a suicide. So he says, quote, The discipline that Theodelina Villar imposed upon herself was analogous, though even more painstaking and detailed. Like Talmudists and Confucians, she sought to make every action irreproachably correct. But her task was even more admirable and difficult than theirs, for the laws of her creed were not eternal, but sensitive to the whims of Paris and Hollywood. So Theodelina Villar is like a fashion model. Quote, Theodelina Villar would make her entrances into Orthodox places at the Orthodox hour with Orthodox adornments and with Orthodox world-weariness. But the world-weariness, the adornments, the hour, and the places would almost immediately pass out of fashion, and so come to serve upon the lips of Theodelina Villar for the very epitome of tackiness. She sought the absolute, like Flaubert, but the absolute in the ephemeral. Her life was exemplary, and yet an inner desperation constantly gnawed at her. She passed through endless metamorphoses, as though fleeing from herself, her coiffure, and the color of her hair were famously unstable, as were her smile, her skin, and the slant of her eyes. And he goes on to talk about how in World War II, her ability to keep up with fashion was disrupted by the German occupation, and he says, quote, on June 6, Theodelina Villar committed the breach of decorum of dying in the middle of Berrios-sur. End quote. And so what Borges is doing here is he's trying to link his fate, his experience, to other more well-known, more understood phenomenon of obsession. But what is Borges' fate in the story? He describes a mythology, a whole world, a whole history surrounding this mythology of an item known as a Zahir. He says that at every point in time, there's one item which is a Zahir. And if a person comes into possession of the Zahir, or he looks at the Zahir, he becomes obsessed with this item. It sort of causes him to fall into this trap of obsession, this sort of debilitating mental illness of obsession. The story starts, in Buenos Aires, the Zahir is a common 20-centavo coin into which a razor or letter opener has scratched the letters NT and the number 2. The date stamped on the face is 1929. In Gujarat, at the end of the 18th century, the Zahir was a tiger. In Java, it was a blind man. In the Sukarta Mosque, stoned by the faithful. In Persia, an astrolabe that Nadir Shah ordered thrown into the sea. In the prisons of Mahdi, in 1892, a small sailor's compass wrapped in a shred of cloth from a turban that Rudolf Karl von Slatin touched. In the synagogue in Cordoba, according to Zottenberg, a vein in the marble of one of the 1,200 pillars in the ghetto in Tetuan, the bottom of a well. He continues, today is the 13th of November. Last June 7 at dawn, the Zahir came into my hands. I am not the man I was then, but I am still able to recall and perhaps recount what happened. I am still, albeit only partially, Borges. And so this story is Borges's description of his obsession, description of his mental illness, of his dissolving into this hyper-focus onto this one object. At one point, he tries to describe to the reader what it feels like to have this kind of obsession, the internal dialogue, the internal experience of this obsession. Quote, possessed without a trace of sleepiness, almost happy, I reflected that there is nothing less material than money, since any coin, a 20-centavo piece, for instance, is, in all truth, a panoply of possible futures. Money is abstract, I said over and over. Money is future time. It could be an evening just outside the city, or a Brahms melody, or maps, or chess, or coffee, or the words of Epictetus, which teach contempt of gold. It is a Proteus more changeable than the Proteus of the Isle of Pharos. It is unforeseeable time, Bergsonian time, not the hard, solid time of Islam or the porch. Adherents of determinism deny that there is any event in the world that is possible, i.e. that might occur. A coin symbolizes our free will. One of the most fascinating things for me about the story is the way Borges describes leaning in to his fate, choosing almost, accepting his fate, even though it's going to be completely debilitating. Quote, time which softens recollections only makes the memory of the Zahir sharper. First I could see the face of it, then the reverse. Now I can see both sides at once. It is not as though the Zahir were made of glass, since one side is not superimposed upon the other. Rather, it is as though the vision were itself spherical, with the Zahir rampant in the center. Anything that is not the Zahir comes to me as though through a filter, and from a distance. Teodolina's disdainful image, physical pain. And now we get to his romanticizing of his fate. Tennyson said that if we could but understand a single flower, we might know who we are and what the world is. Perhaps he was trying to say that there is nothing, however humble, that does not imply the history of the world and its infinite concatenations of causes and effects. Perhaps he was trying to say that the visible world can be seen entire in every image, just as Schopenhauer tells us that the will expresses itself entire in every man and woman. The Kabbalists believed that man is a microcosm, a symbolic mirror of the universe. If one were to believe Tennyson, everything would be, everything, even the unbearable Zahir. And now he continues in this vein. He tells us that he knows that in a short period of time, he is going to be completely cut off from the world, completely unable to function. And he describes that. Quote, before the year 1948, Julia's fate will have overtaken me. I will have to be fed and dressed. I will not know whether it's morning or night. I will not know the man Borges was. Calling that future terrible is a fallacy, since none of the future's circumstances will in any way affect me. One might as well call terrible the pain of an anesthetized patient whose skull is being trepanned. I will no longer perceive the universe. I will perceive the Zahir. Idealist doctrine has it that the verbs to live and to dream are at every point synonymous. For me, thousands upon thousands of appearances will pass into one. A complex dream will pass into a simple one. Others will dream that I am mad, while I dream of the Zahir. When every man on earth thinks day and night of the Zahir, which will be dream and which reality, the earth or the Zahir? And so thus far, he's talking about his acceptance and the fact that it doesn't bother him that he's going mad and that he will have to be dressed and fed because he will not be aware of those things. And now here is really the description of what he sees as the power and the spiritual value of this mental illness that he's describing. Quote, in the waste and empty hours of the night, I am still able to walk through the streets. Dawn often surprises me upon a bench in the Plaza Garay thinking, or trying to think, about that passage in the Asrar Nama where it is said that the Zahir is the shadow of the rose and the rending of the veil. I link that pronouncement to this fact. In order to lose themselves in God, the Sufis repeat their own name or the 99 names of God until the names mean nothing anymore. I long to travel that path. Perhaps by thinking about the Zahir unceasingly, I can manage to wear it away. Perhaps behind the coin is God.